Hello and welcome to the show. This is Everything Under the Sun. My name is Ty. Hope all of you are doing well out there. I'm not sure if any of you gotten on board with just like doing investing or anything like that, but it's something that's really amazing. I know that I was just reading an article about just how there are a lot more younger people doing investing now, which is something I think is really amazing because as you start investing more in different things, I think we start engaging more in just the world around us because a lot of these companies that are being invested in are companies that are producing things in the world, So as we start doing that, we're engaging more in the world and we're also profiting from it if you're making wise investments. So I think it's just really something amazing. There was a kid, I read an article about this kid that had GameStop stock, and I guess his mom had bought it for him like when he was younger, and it was like only like $1 or something like that. And that huge frenzy happened, and he ended up being able to cash out at like $2,500, which is, I mean, a lot for a 10-year-old kid. But I think that's really amazing. And just as we learn more within ourselves, as we start like trading and investing in different things, we can gain that knowledge and give that knowledge to the people that we love and care about. So I think that's like really one amazing thing about that. It's a great way to, just have that learning experience of being able to, buy and trade stock, and possibly a way of, bringing in some extra money if you're, good at making investments. So it's really just something that's somewhat of a win-win. You don't have to invest a lot of money. I think a lot of people feel like you have to invest like $1,000 or something to start investing in different things, and that's not the case at all. I think when I first started investing, I maybe threw like $100 into something, and then maybe threw like $20 more, and then just kind of like adding more and more. And then as I got more comfortable, that's when I started adding larger amounts because I started realizing, I can see this trend, I can understand this more, I have more knowledge, and I feel more comfortable and able to do that. Obviously, don't invest money that you aren't willing to lose, but, it's something just to get you started. And maybe if you have kids that are interested in something, maybe buying them like a penny stock or something like that, and who knows, maybe it'll turn into GameStop and shoot off the roof. But yeah, anyway, for the sake of time, I'm just going to get going with this episode because I feel like there's a lot within this topic of just consciousness and what it really is, So I'm going to shake the box here and get the topic out for next week. Thank you so much for sending those topics in. Again, you can send those to everything.sunpodcast@gmail.com or any of the social media pages that I will link at the end of this. And again, like there's no topic that's off limits. Again, I think that this is really amazing, and I do appreciate every single topic that comes in. So the topic for next week is going to be family. And I actually remember this topic being given to me. It was actually given to me by my grandmother, I think, after the social obligations episode. And I think it's something that's really amazing because so often we feel obligated to family, and it's not necessarily always a bad obligation, but there are obligations that we have that may cause us to move in a different way than we would normally move. So in this topic, it says on the piece of paper, it says family, and then in parentheses it says circumstances, obligations, and structures. And again, like those are all just amazing things. Again, we feel obligated to family in so many different domains, but we also create our family, and we have different family structures, and we have different just systems that work within our family. So I think that's going to be an amazing topic and something that I think will kind of expand this idea of family that maybe many of us have had before. But that's going to be the topic for next week. This week is going to be the topic of consciousness. And, this idea of consciousness is something that's just really amazing. It's something that, I love this type of stuff. This is something that I think about a lot, not necessarily just in terms of just like what is consciousness, but just like what is this, what is this experience that we're having? Like, what is this understanding that we have within ourselves? This feeling of, whatever it is, like all these different feelings, all these different experiences that we have, it is consciousness. It's because of consciousness. It's because of, the ability to perceive consciousness and really question that consciousness. And it's like, as I'm kind of speaking, there are so many different levels to that conversation. And as I go through this episode, there's going to be just a few different layers of consciousness that really can culminate this idea of just what is really consciousness, and really expanding the idea of how we're looking at consciousness. Now, of course, I have my own thoughts on consciousness, but my thoughts may be less empirical in the ways that other people are studying consciousness. Some people want scientific research, something that's quantifiable to say, this is what consciousness is. Some people are looking at consciousness in a way that's maybe less abstract than the way that I'm looking at it. Some people want to look at consciousness in the way that it's like something that's, this is what consciousness is. And you can teach that to other people, and you can say, like, this is what consciousness is, now use it. Kind of like a tool, something that just is. But the most important part of this idea of consciousness, in my opinion, is that it may be a lot more expansive than we even realize. So in starting us off, I mean, this idea of consciousness, it's something that, again, with living in a world of science and really wanting to explain things in the scientific means, that's where consciousness really started. As we started exploring the brain more and seeing how different neural pathways are lighting up or different parts of the brain are lighting up in correspondence to experiences that we're having, people started looking at that as far as how can this tell us about consciousness? How can this tell us about the experiences that are around us? So again, when looking at consciousness, there are so many people that are looking at it from this way of looking at the brain, looking at how the brain responds to these perceived experiences that we're having, and that being the quantifiable way of showing consciousness. There's a neuroscientist, Anil Seth, and there's a snippet of the TED Talk that I'm going to reference here in a bit, but in this, he's essentially breaking down these ideas of consciousness that he has. And one of these ideas is sense of self, and that being a form of consciousness, just our awareness of ourself, our self in this world, our experience of even noticing consciousness or experiencing the different things we experience. The experience of suffering in our life is something that is due to this idea of consciousness and our awareness of self in this conscious state. The second part of his idea is a world consciousness. So our awareness of the world around us and the objects in the world around us, even ourselves in the world, like our physical selves, that your hand is there in relation to everything else around you, and how the things we see around us are being perceived by us, and we're responding in an according way. But the interesting thing about this idea of world consciousness that he started to notice is that our perception of the world may not be something that is as simple as us seeing things and interpreting that information. That maybe our perception of the world is more based on the things that we believe within ourselves, the things that we know within ourselves, and how we interpret that in relation to the world around us. So in this example, he does a little experiment that kind of demonstrates this fact that information within ourselves, the knowledge that we have within ourselves, is something that will change the reality and the perception of the things around us that we're experiencing. So this is a clip.
Here's one more example, which shows just how quickly the brain can use new predictions to change what we consciously experience. Have a listen to this. Sounded strange, right? Have a listen again and see if you can get anything. Still strange. Now listen to this.
I think Brexit is a really terrible idea.
Which I do. So you heard some words there, right? Now listen to the first sound again. I'm just going to replay it. Yeah? So you can now hear words there. Once more for luck. Okay, so what's going on here is the remarkable thing is the sensory information coming into the brain hasn't changed at all. All that's changed is your brain's best guess of the causes of that sensory information, and that changes what you consciously hear. Now, all this puts the brain basis of perception in a bit of a different light. Instead of perception depending largely on signals coming into the brain from the outside world, it depends as much, if not more, on perceptual predictions flowing in the opposite direction. We don't just passively perceive the world, we actively generate it. The world we experience comes as much, if not more, from the inside out as from the outside in.
Now, I think that's something that's so fascinating, just this idea that the things that we feel within ourselves are literally creating the world around us. And I know that many of us have heard those things, we create our reality and things like this, but this is a neuroscientist, someone that's literally trying to find quantifiable data on the world around us and is realizing that many of the things that we see and perceive, this idea of consciousness and conscious awareness, is something that's wildly based on the things that are inherently within us, or things that knowledge that we possess within ourselves. And I mean, of course, there's so many different levels of that, because what is consciousness if it's something that can be shifted or altered based on the things that are understood within ourselves? But although his research did highlight a very important aspect of just consciousness and our awareness of the world around us, it doesn't really highlight just this expansiveness of what consciousness is, because it can't truly just be our perceptual awareness. In the beginning of the podcast, or in the beginning of the TED Talk, he speaks about how he experienced a lack of consciousness because he was under anesthesia. He was having a surgery, and they put him under, and he lost awareness of his perception awareness of time and space, and he woke up in a daze not knowing how long or how much time had passed. And in this, he describes a loss of consciousness. But in that, he's describing consciousness as being something that is determined upon wakefulness, being awake. And if we're not awake, then we're not conscious. But as we dive more into this idea of consciousness and just really what that is, we start seeing that wakefulness and consciousness are not the same thing. Just because you're asleep or under anesthesia doesn't mean consciousness has dissipated. Consciousness is something that people are starting to see as possibly being just a fact of life. It's something that is just part of life. And this is the idea that philosopher David Chalmers discussed in his TED Talk, speaking about just this idea of consciousness possibly being something that is just a fundamental part of life. And this is a radical idea because this is something that can transform the way that we're actually looking at consciousness. So here's a short excerpt of what he was speaking about.
If you can't explain consciousness in terms of the existing fundamentals, space, time, mass, charge, then as a matter of logic, you need to expand the list. The natural thing to do is to postulate consciousness itself as something fundamental, a fundamental building block of nature. This doesn't mean you suddenly can't do science with it. This opens up the way for you to do science with it. What we then need is to study the fundamental laws governing consciousness, the laws that connect consciousness to other fundamentals, space, time, mass, physical processes.
So this idea of consciousness being something that's fundamental, then that means that it's part of the very essence of our lives. Again, like gravity or space or time, it's something that is a basis in itself. And if that's the case, that's really merging into this idea of panpsychism, this idea that everything has some level of consciousness within it. And this is something that is really radical, again, in this idea of consciousness, because it starts to really shift the things that we truly believe about the world around us and the things that are within the world around us and ourselves being part of the world around us and everything that comes along with that. So this idea of panpsychism is something that's really amazing, and this is probably like the longer clip within this episode, but this is a clip from a well-known actor / comedian speaking about just this idea of panpsychism. He has a great podcast, Under the Skin. I'm not sure if many of you have heard of it, and if you do, then you know exactly who I'm speaking about. Brene Brown was on the show, someone who I've spoken about at least twice in this podcast. So in this clip, I think he does a really amazing job explaining panpsychism and just what that is and really the implications of what that can mean as far as us and moving forward and really just understanding ourselves in this world. So here's a clip.
This week I spoke to Dr. Philip Goff, a philosopher and expert on the theory of panpsychism. Panpsychism is the idea that consciousness is a fundamental component of the universe, not evolved biologically in the material realm, i.e. most people, dualistic folks or materialistic folks, believe that consciousness has come from material. But panpsychism espouses the idea that consciousness was always present. The early panpsychism suggests that consciousness is a fundamental element of all things. It's not suggesting that an electron is conscious, like a little electron with hopes and dreams and desires and fears and stuff like that, but more that it's a form of awareness. And when Dr. Philip said that to me, I was struck by how that correlates to things that I've heard a lot of spiritual teachers say about even a complex form of consciousness like a human being, that our awareness should be simple awareness, not attached to our desire, not attached to our memory. Awareness, aware of your body, thinking of your consciousness as space and your body as an object that's dropped into it, your desires, your thoughts, all things that's dropped into your conscious awareness. The more that we identify or experience the awareness rather than attaching to its contents, the more free we can become. If you are attached to your own identity, if you're attached to your own wants and desires, you can never be free. You will be pulled through life on a roller coaster toboggan ride of your own desires and needs. But if you can return to this state of conscious awareness, vibrant awareness, there is the possibility at least for freedom. He says that all components of reality may in some way be conscious, and this resolves a lot of long-lasting, previously irresolvable philosophical and indeed physical problems. We can't ever demonstrate how consciousness emerges. There are neurological models that show how intelligence behaves, how the brain behaves, how consciousness appears to behave in certain ways, but no one will ever be able to demonstrate through physical scientific discipline how consciousness happens or what the experience of consciousness is like. I also learned that Galileo, in his early theories in establishing the scientific method, deliberately extracted the problem of consciousness, knowing even then, the prophet and philosopher that he was, that the phenomena of experience would never be able to be understood in materialist terms, that we should confine science to the study of that which can be tested and explained. He mentioned how atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett says there is no such thing as consciousness because consciousness can never be observed or studied. The only consciousness you truly know is there is your own consciousness. You know that you are watching this right now on your phone, that you've hovered, you've not swiped up yet. Have you tapped the screen to unmute it so you can hear me, or you're just letting it subtitle right by you? What I'm saying is that the theory of panpsychism is an interesting one because it helps us to navigate some pretty significant hard problems. That's what they call it, the hard problem of consciousness. And also it supports a lot of esoteric, spiritual and mystical ideas about the nature of oneness, i.e., if consciousness has always been present, if consciousness is present in everything, then there is a transcendent reality beyond space and time and the physical world as we understand it that connects all of us. That there is an ultimate truth that we can all aspire to, that is truly universal, that there is something accessible to all of us. If we accept this, if we aspire to it, if we experience it individually and collectively through spiritual practice, through prayer and meditation, then we have a chance of real change. Then we have a chance of radically reorganizing society rather than superficially shuffling chessboard pieces around on the black and white Masonic grid of our who's them dudes? Illuminati, the Illuminati grid. So I would say this to you: check out that episode of Under the Skin where I talk about panpsychism, and consider if indeed you want to change yourself, if indeed you want to change the world. Think about what is the crucible where all change and all experience is coming from. Awareness itself. Panpsychism could be a theory that changes everything.
And I truly think it will. I think it's something that is so expansive and will allow us to kind of explore these different avenues of just who we are as people. And something that I think just within the culmination of research, whether it's neuroscientists or philosophers or just actors, comedians, and by the way, that was Russell Brand, again, Under the Skin. If you haven't listened to that podcast, it's really amazing. The rest of that talk is super amazing. He's speaking with Dr. Philip Goff, which I think is mentioned in the beginning of that clip, but the idea that he's speaking about panpsychism, I think this is something that can radically change just so many aspects of our lives and help us to grow in many ways. Like, again, like our society as a whole can transform radically in just accepting this understanding, and not necessarily accepting it like, willingly or just like, lackadaisically, but really thinking about this idea of consciousness and really giving yourself that time to explore it and really identifying what it means for you. And I think that as we start to do that more, we start to realize that there are a lot of correlations. And even thinking about this idea of consciousness in so many different respects, we see that there is this correlation. We see that there's this connection within all of it. All of the different ways that people are looking at consciousness, there's a theme. I think that from the beginning of time, from when people really started thinking about consciousness, there's a connection within all of it, within religion, within science, within just our experiences as people and humans in this world and beings in life. I think that it's something that encompasses all of it because, consciousness is everything. So as we're thinking about consciousness and consciousness being all things, like, again, like this is meaning that even the most material things like dirt or a rock has consciousness. And this is something that's really, really hard for individuals to accept or to think about because, a rock doesn't really have feelings, or they're not going through some existential crisis trying to figure out what they want to do in life or what it all means, But even though that's not the case, it doesn't mean that there's no consciousness there. And I believe the hardest part of believing that consciousness exists in even these material things is because we have this idea that intelligence, as far as intelligence as we know it, is something that defines consciousness. And that's something I think that, we say that we kind of believe, but we also don't believe, because a baby is conscious doesn't mean that it has the general intelligence that I guess a grown adult has. So we're quantifying intelligence based on our standards as, functional adult human beings, but it doesn't mean that levels of consciousness don't exist on different, on different levels. So in this talk, this is Alan Watts, which is someone that I've spoken about before in this podcast. Really amazing. I think he's great at using metaphors, that he's great at using allegory to explain the things that he's wanting to get across and these ideas he wants to get across. So in this idea of consciousness and intelligence, and how we as humans believe that in many respects that we were blessed with intelligence by however means, like whatever creator or something gave us intelligence. And that removes this idea that consciousness, and more importantly, intelligence within consciousness, was something that wasn't present before. So this is just a small clip from a lecture that he gave, that he's kind of just speaking about this idea of intelligence and how essentially consciousness is something that was present even within the material substances and gases that were in the beginning of the universe.
You cannot get an intelligent organism, such as a human being, out of an unintelligent universe. The saying in the New Testament that figs do not grow on thistles nor grapes on thorns applies equally to the world. You do not find an intelligent organism living in an unintelligent environment. Look, here is a tree in the garden, and every summer it produces apples. And we call it an apple tree because the tree apples. That's what it does. All right. Now here is a solar system inside a galaxy. And one of the peculiarities of this solar system is that at least on the planet Earth, the thing peoples. In just the same way that an apple tree apples. Now maybe 2 million years ago, somebody came from another galaxy in a flying saucer and had a look at this solar system, and they looked it over and shrugged their shoulders and said, just a bunch of rocks. And they went away. Later on, maybe 2 million years later, they came around and they looked at it again, and they said, excuse me, we thought it was a bunch of rocks, but it's peopling. And it's alive. After all, it has done something intelligent. Because you see, we grow out of this world in exactly the same way that the apples grow on the apple tree. If evolution means anything, it means that. But you see, we curiously twist it. We say, well, first of all, in the beginning, there was nothing but gas and rock. And then intelligence happened to arise in it, like a sort of fungus or slime on the top of the whole thing. But we're thinking in a way, you see, that disconnects the intelligence from the rocks. Where there are rocks, watch out. Watch out, because the rocks are going eventually to come alive, and they're going to have people crawling over them. It's only a matter of time, just in the same way as the seed, the acorn, is eventually going to turn into the oak, because it has the potentiality of that within it.
That last part, I think, is the key part within this whole idea, is that it has a potentiality within it. And I think that's something that is the biggest idea within all of this, is that we have the potential to do so much and be so much when we really realize how big this idea of consciousness is. Like what is consciousness, and how does it relate to who we are as people, and the expansiveness of how far we can go as individuals. So now it really comes down to this understanding of consciousness, and how does that fit in with our day-to-day lives? How does that fit in with the things that we've believed up until this point about who we are and our place in this world, or our part in this world? So in this second clip, it's actually also Alan Watts from the same lecture, but just a little bit later in the lecture, and he's speaking about his two ideas of consciousness. So as I spoke earlier, there was the neuroscientist Anil Seth, who spoke about his two ideas of consciousness being a sense of self and world consciousness. Now for Alan Watts, the consciousness, it's very similar, but also different in the way that he's explaining it. So this is the clip.
But that all depends, you see, upon a false notion of what is oneself. Now, the reason why we have this false notion of ourselves is, as far as I can understand it, that we have specialized in one particular kind of consciousness. Being very general and rough, we have two kinds of consciousness. One I will call the spotlight, and the other the floodlight. The spotlight is what we call conscious attention. And that is trained into us from childhood as the most valuable form of consciousness. When the teacher in class says, "Pay attention," everybody stares and looks fast at the teacher like that. That's spotlight consciousness. Fixing your mind on one thing at a time. Concentrate. And even though you may not be able to have a very long attention span, nevertheless you concentrate. You use your spotlight, one thing after another, flip, 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 like that. But we also have another kind of consciousness, which I'll call the floodlight. For example, you can drive your car for several miles with a friend sitting next to you, and your spotlight consciousness will be completely absorbed in talking to your friend. Nevertheless, your floodlight consciousness will manage the driving of the car, will notice all the stoplights, the other idiots on the road, and so on, and you'll get there safely, without even thinking about it. But our culture has taught us to specialize in spotlight consciousness and to identify ourselves with that form of consciousness alone. I am my spotlight consciousness. My conscious attention, that is my ego, that is me. And very largely we ignore the floodlight. Now the floodlight consciousness is working all the time. Every nerve end that we have is its instrument. You know, you can go out to luncheon or something and you sit next to Mrs. So-and-so, and you go home and your wife says to you, "Was Mrs. So-and-so there?" "Yes, I sat next to her." "Well, what was she wearing?" "Well, I haven't the faintest idea." You saw, but you didn't notice. Now, because we have been brought up to identify ourselves with the spotlight consciousness, and the floodlight consciousness is undervalued, we have this sensation of ourselves as being just the spotlight. Just the ego that looks and attends to this and that and the other. And so we ignore and are unaware of the vast, vast extent of our being.
So now we have these two ideas of consciousness that are different than what we were speaking about earlier as far as this neuroscientist approach with just looking at consciousness as far as sense of self and a world consciousness, our awareness of the world and the things around us. Now, in that, in comparison to, the idea of consciousness that Alan Watts just explained, is that essentially what Anil Seth in his neuroscientist approach or his neuroscientific approach, what he was explaining was basically the spotlight consciousness, where our perception and our awareness of just the things that are around us, the people, the experiences that we're having, that's ourself, that's our consciousness, that is everything that is. And this idea can be demonstrated because, again, that idea of wakefulness, our perception being, like while we were awake, that being consciousness. And if we attribute our wakefulness as being consciousness and our perceptions as being consciousness, then we are truly only focused on our spotlight consciousness. So this idea of floodlight consciousness is really opening the pool, opening this into something that's really much more expansive than just our perceptual awareness, that we're picking up on things, or that there's a consciousness that's more like an ocean, and we are, within that ocean. And within that, we have the opportunity to experience a vastness. It's like again, like he said at the end of it, it's like if we only focus on the spotlight rather than the floodlight, then we won't really be able to understand the extent of our being, like really just like how vast of beings we are. So in culminating this idea that all things around us have consciousness and that we come from, again, the universe around us and the consciousness that already existed within that, if all things have consciousness, then again, we're looking at things, we start to look at things in a very different way. How do we have this conscious awareness that seems to allow us to think and feel and, wonder about different things, yet the consciousness that exists within a rock or a piece of dirt isn't going to have that same feeling, or does it? And I think this from a spiritual leader, this next clip is from Sadhguru. I'm not really sure how to say his name, if I said that correctly, but he's basically explaining consciousness in this way of like culminating all this information that has kind of been spoken about, our perceptual awareness of the world, our experience of consciousness being something that's fundamental, and this panpsychic view of just consciousness being within all things. Now, how do we actually make sense of that? Again, with our consciousness being something that's very advanced and perceptual and an ability to question all the things that we experience, to the experiences of, material substances that don't seem to have that same cognizance. And I think he has an amazing way of explaining this, and I love the metaphor that he uses within the conversation. So this is the clip here.
It is just that it is only the human creature on this planet who has the neurological capability and sophistication of mechanism that if they allow it, they can access this dimension of consciousness. No other creature is really capable of accessing it. This doesn't mean there is no consciousness in them. Without that, the life process wouldn't happen. There is consciousness even where there is no body, all right? Only thing is, you need a certain sophisticated instrument to access that, which is the human mechanism. This is why we consider being human is a great privilege, because you have access to dimensions beyond your physical boundaries. That is the fundamental significance of being human. So, let us not misunderstand the instrument and what we see. If you take a telescope and see, you saw another galaxy, but the galaxy is not produced by the telescope. The galaxy is there. The telescope only gave you an access. Similarly, your body, your brain, whatever, I don't want to identify different things, from your hair to your toes, everything is body as far as I'm concerned, including your brain. It is just another dimension of the body. So this body, if we keep it in a certain way, if we do not contaminate it with too many ideas, philosophies, identities, if you keep it in a certain level of openness, this will become an access point to what we are referring to as consciousness, or the basis of the life that we are, in a way. So somebody can call it consciousness, somebody can call it a being, somebody says this is God. Well, we can use as much vocabulary as you want. Essentially, we are trying to put a meaning on something which cannot be defined, which has no meaning. Meaning is a consequence of human psychological process. Psychological process is a consequence of accumulated memory. So you cannot slap one meaning from your mind upon a limitless possibility, which is the very basis of our existence. So this is what is the fundamental mistake, that we are trying to take a piece of our psychological process and trying to understand what is consciousness. Consciousness is not something that you can understand. Understand means there must be a meaning. There is no meaning to it. There is no meaning to the existence. It's just a tremendous phenomena, but you can experience it. You have the necessary instruments to experience it, not the instruments in your lab. You as a person, you have the necessary instrument to experience this. Will you allow it or not, is the only question.
I feel like that is truly something that is at the basis of what we're all looking for with this idea of consciousness. We have the ability to truly transform our lives and really go so far if we start to realize just how expansive this idea of consciousness is. And I love this idea of the telescope where, again, like the universe is already there, like the things, the stars are already there in the sky. We just used a telescope. We had a device that allowed us to see it, but it was already there. And this idea of consciousness is something that it's like, if it's already there, and consciousness is something that allowed intelligent life as humans to develop, what further potential does it have? How much further can we go? And that's why I love this idea of consciousness, because again, there are so many more questions. As we dissect it more, we realize we're not going in, we're expanding it open. We're opening this field up to being something so much bigger. As we question more and as we get more answers, we realize that we know less and less, but we can still experience it. And I think that's one of the biggest things. We can toil with this idea of consciousness. We can grow, just frustrated with not really being able to understand, but at the end of the day, it's something that exists. It's something that it is part of us, and although we can question it in a playful way and try to truly understand it and just trying to understand our lives, I think that's where we can have a lot of personal growth and just growth and understanding. But I think when it becomes something that we strive too hard to try to explain, where it becomes a detriment to us, and we're no longer experiencing it, we're being run by it. So I don't know, I think about this idea of consciousness, and it sometimes makes my head just like explode, just like thinking about just the vastness of it all. But at the end, I know that, it's something that it just is. So I can come back and I can rest easy knowing that, although I can't explain it and I can't define it, it's still something that exists, and that's okay. And I think that, like, as we allow that to just be, we allow ourselves to just be, and that's something that can bring us just so much more peace in the moment. So that's all I really have for this episode. I hope that it was something that was a good culmination of just different ideas. I feel like, again, this idea of consciousness is something that can be looked at from so many different perspectives, and I tried to make this episode kind of flow to where it's like more empirical based, where it's like that's kind of the approach that we have, to going more into this idea of just being more expansive, something that maybe doesn't have definitions, doesn't have the boundaries that we like to have. We like to have neat lines and everything's in boxes, but this idea of consciousness is something so much more expansive, and I just wanted to kind of bring that into reality, where it's like our most scientific approaches towards this question of what is consciousness is still leading us to this way of being very just intangible, which is something that I think humans don't really like that much. But I love this idea of consciousness. I love this idea of just exploring life and what it means. I'm so thankful that this was something that was suggested. Thank you so much for sending that in. This is definitely a conversation that can be had over and over again and can definitely last much longer than this podcast episode. But that same thing can be said for many of the topics that are covered in this show. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed. Again, if you have any thoughts or ideas or comments that you'd like to share about this, you can send those to everything.sunpodcast@gmail.com or on any of the social media pages. I think comments or ratings are also good. So if you want to rate the podcast, that'd be really good, because I think it makes it more noticeable or present. I'm not really sure how a lot of technology works. But I think that's helpful. So if you feel like it, that'd be something that's really awesome. But anyways, Instagram, everything.sunpodcast, Twitter, @everysunpodcast, and Facebook, @everythingunderthesun with Ty. And yeah, that's all I got. So love you all, and I will see you next time.